start out, as we always do, with the reading, and this is chapter 21, 5 to 8. And of course, we have, from the beginning, we have this division always. On one side we have religious people, on the other side we have secular people. And religious people, of course, think that there is God, and not only that, but that God has spoken. And as far as the Abrahamic community is concerned, faith community, that God has really spoken to Abraham in Ur, which is not too far away from Baghdad, and that he then has spoken to Moses and to Jacob and to Isaac and to Jesus and to Muhammad. And so that is the religious side. And on the secular side, we have people who do not accept this. They don't think that God has spoken. So we begin with the religious side, and then we move over. So the chapter 21 there, John, it's not the John who wrote the Gospels, probably not. Higher criticism, that is the worldly side, has come to the conclusion that these must be two different people. So now 21, we have the first part there, now the second part. Then the one sitting on the throne spoke. So this Abrahamic faith community believes in God the one, not different ones. And we have in Islam, of course, there is no addition, he has no son, where this oneness is particularly emphasized. Then the one sitting on the throne spoke. Now I am making the whole of creation new. That is the essential sentence. That is the core sentence of Christianity. Now I am making the whole of creation new. And of course this messianic sentence is also with the Jewish people, and also the Islamic people have this. He said, write this, that what I am saying is sure and will come true. So there is the question of truth, and there's always the question of certainty. So the author wants to make the reader certain. And then he said, it is already done. I am the Alpha and the Omega. There is this, what the mystics call the now moment, what God will do in the future or the past, that is done right now, the now moment. Also Walter Benjamin of the critical theorists emphasized that very much. Who is thirsty, there I will give water from the well of life, free to anybody, and I will be his God and he a son to me. But the legacy for cowards, for those who break their word or worship obscenities, for murderers and fornicators, and for fortune tellers, idolaters, or any other sort of liars, is the second death in the burning lake of sulfur. So there is a first death which people face, and then there is a second one on top of this. So this is the core text. You could say this, particularly this one sentence there. Now I am making the whole creation new. And we said already that, of course, Thomas More now writes this Utopia. The Utopia is not a replacement of the eschatology, but it is the answer to the question what Christians or Muslims or Jews should do in the meantime before the Messiah comes. Should they just wait, or should they do something? And the Utopia means that people can work on society in preparation of the eschaton, which means the union of God with his people, and the eschata, no death anymore, no weeping, all tears will be wiped off from people's faces, and so on. Also here the core sentence of all genuine religion, namely the love for the finite and mortal and transitory little human being. Okay, so that was our reading, and now the last time we ended up with differentiating between an authoritarian type of Christianity and also Islam and also Judaism, and then humanistic type of Catholicism or Christianity and so on. So Erich Fromm, for instance, would say that Küng and Rahner and so on are humanists in Catholicism, which is overall authoritarian, and he asked Catholics that they should convert to the gospel, to this here, also what we just read, and should not emphasize so much bureaucracy and foreign politics and all this, but should convert to the New Testament, and then they would become a different type of Christianity, a humanistic one. And it's interesting that people like Hitler, of course, loved this authoritarian one. They thought that a non-authoritarian religion could not really survive. And this authoritarian one comes particularly from the Roman side. So we have in Christianity, we have, and in Judaism, Islam too, we have the influence from Jerusalem, we have the influence from Athens, and we have the influence from Rome. And the Roman influence is particularly authoritarian. That's where fascism comes from. And so when Hitler saw a cardinal marching around in his uniform, he had great respect because he looked like a real Roman. But when he had a Protestant minister with his bourgeois hat on and so on, he had no respect for them. So, and now whatever Hitler loved, we should be suspicious of. He loved authoritarian Catholicism or authoritarian Protestantism too. He set up a Bishop Müller as the empire bishop. Hi, how are you?
Rehearsal party ready for their wedding tomorrow.
Oh my God, yes, this is important. I'm still getting married, that's good. Okay, so that was, I think we ended up to this, and I think we traced it in the last minutes, we traced it down even to our situation here, to what extent we are still an authoritarian club here, and to what extent we have more an Erasmian, humanistic, Küngian, and Thomas More type of a Catholicism. So, and we looked at this in very detail. And, who as one, I think one can do this analysis, and then one knows better where we stand. Now, we are still in the crisis. Our depression now is 1 year old in this country. The stock market also went down a little bit today, again, as it did all week long. And people are obviously suffering, and this is why we have our discourse here. Workers lose their jobs into the 10,000s, and their savings are gone, and their homes are gone, and the pensions are gone. We have Roosevelt liberals in power now, who use this socially modified liberalism in order to deal with the crisis. And we can hope that some stabilization will take place, but what has not yet penetrated the brains entirely is that it will not rescue capitalism. So they just talked tonight on the Wall Street that there were these rumors of nationalization and federalization. They are not only rumors, they will have to get used to the fact that they are more than the rumors, and that this is where we will have to go. And that is very painful for our thinking, because we were used to say this is not American. American means private initiative, means the emphasis on the individual, and everybody should not wait for the state. We should take care of ourselves. And this is a good principle, of course. That is the truth of liberalism. But what if there are huge collective problems? 40 million people in the slums, or 40 million people no health insurance, and so on and so on. Then liberalism comes to its end, and then that is why Roosevelt modified it and broadened it, but it has been broadened further, and even if that is done, it will not rescue that social organization, this capitalistic social organization which we are used to. And therefore, we asked ourselves here if faith can, that is our specific question, if faith can do something in this situation, if it can make a contribution. So these Roosevelt liberals and their thinking is very much in charge now, and that is a good thing. But our specific issue here is if faith can somehow play a role in all of this. We know what has brought us into this disaster, and these 8 years of the privatization and decontrolling and depolicing has brought the greediness and made it limitless, and therefore capitalism was driven into this extreme. Without these 8 years, it could have lasted longer than it will now, because by letting it loose completely, it moved faster to its end than it would have been the case if, for instance, Roosevelt liberals had been in charge and would have done the policing, which is in the papers, which is in the laws, and which could have been practiced. So what can faith say to those workers who lose things now? Maybe nothing. We have to be honest about this, and after we are honest about it, then we can ask if there is not a little bit more. Usually, what in the Great Depression of 1929, what the churches, Protestant Catholic Church usually said is, we have to pray, and then charity, and soup kitchens, and so on, and these are all worthwhile things. But will that really console somebody who has lost his job when we say he should pray and when we give him charity? So we had in our movie where Wolsey, for instance, had this problem that the king had no son, and Thomas More, as a good believer, just said you have to pray. And Wolsey, and this is of course the secularization even of the clergy and the high clergy, he was rather skeptical and said, well, you Thomas, you just go on praying, but this is not what will bring us heir and what will let the house tutor survive. So the confrontation of faith with the brutal realities of everyday life, economic life and sociological life. So as soon as faith questions are pulled over into economics and into sociology, then it gets very tough. So therefore we can say, well, it is wonderful prayer and also of course charity, but that will not be a solution. That will not show us the way into a post-capitalistic or postmodern type of society where we are going now. And but maybe that is not the last word. So that is why we are here. And the question is, for instance, should we continue with an idealistic interpretation of Christianity? We would say, search the kingdom first, and then the food and the employment and the housing and the clothing will be given to you. Or should we turn it around? Do we have to turn it around materialistically and saying first we have to see to it that there is food and that there are jobs and there's housing, and then the kingdom will be given to us by itself? So there is the possibility of an idealistic to continue with the Platonic and an Aristotelian interpretation of Christianity, or to rather move toward, and I would say also Judaism and Islam, or to move into a materialistic one. A materialistic one will stress the suffering of individual people. Materialism comes from French doctors, and doctors are closest to our body and what happens to it and our organs and so on. And so maybe the main criterion for a materialistic type of a religion would be the love for the transitory and finite and mortal human being. When you are very Platonic, very Aristotelian, you have these wonderful ideas, but you don't get down to the body and to the suffering of the body and to the healing of the body and so on. So it may be very important that we shift from this traditional type, idealistic type of religion to a materialistic one. But the old idealistic one was also very often combined something not so nice, namely a double life, that people on one side lived a public idealistic life according to the ideals and so on, and then they lived another life which was more materialistic and so on. We just had recently a case, a founder of an American order with many seminaries in this country who lived a double life like this, so that they found out that not only that he had a daughter, but that he also had a lot of altar boys whom he abused and so on. So there was always a money cake, a bright side, and then a dark side to it, mixed up with authoritarianism and imposing of these ideals. And then there is something else in us somehow. The chimpanzee is also there. You have probably heard of this chimpanzee story, where a chimpanzee who is 7 times stronger than we are, I don't know what happened to it since we departed from them, but nevertheless he almost killed another person who was called in. And so the unbelievable aggressiveness in these people, and people who know, how chimpanzees react, they should never be taken into the house. The woman wanted to befriend the chimpanzee and be friendly to him or her or whatever, and then suddenly became aggressive, and the old nature broke through, and she called a neighbor, and this chimpanzee just ruined the whole person, their body parts and so on. They were used to run over there before we departed and afterwards into another territory and massacre another tribe, and particularly their sexual organs were massacred, and then they would run back and would sing the national anthem and so on. So this is part in us. This is in us. That's what the psychoanalysis calls the id, and which is to a large extent unconscious, so that we think sometimes we don't have this, and then we are terribly surprised that everybody has it in himself. In religious terms, we may talk about the original sin or a certain disqualification of the species, but whatever, if we talk about it in a secular way or if we talk about it in a religious way, it's the same facticity laying underneath, that there are things in us which are dangerous somehow. So, and which an idealistic type of a religion may not look at or may repress or may not face and so on. So that's a serious question now, and we would ask if Thomas More can help us to make that turn from an idealistic religion into a materialistic one, and materialistic not in a bad sense now, but materialistic in the sense to take the individual and his pain or her pain and suffering from all these earthly things, like not having a job and not having a house and not having savings and not having a pension, really to take that seriously and not as something, which is negligible or whatever, but that this really is us, and that religion, the core of religion, is the love to this transitory, finite, mortal little person there, and not great ideas or whatever. I mean, wonderful ideas, but the love for ideas is not so important as the love for this transitory person. So that is, and now we have to say right away that, of course, Thomas More stands in a great philosophical tradition. We mentioned Erasmus, but also Plato. I think that the story about the island, Utopia, and about the utopians, and Utopos, that was the leader of the whole thing, that this is very Platonic in many ways. So Plato developed a state, an idea of the state, of an ideal state, and somehow, these are, Thomas More, the Renaissance person. They read the Bible again in the original text, but they also read Plato and Aristotle and so on. And so we must suspect right away that Thomas More may be maybe in that idealistic tradition. But all the great idealists also had a strong materialistic element. And so we can look for this, to what extent there are also in his idealism materialistic tendencies which could help us now in our present transition period. Okay, so that what we are concerned with here is the suffering which is going on now and which you hear about it, but with all of this suffering, as long as it doesn't touch our own body, and it is not our own pension fund which goes, and it's not our own job and our own salary, then that is something distant, and we have sometimes a hard time to empathize. I know how shocked I was when my son Steve came home once from Western and said, my teacher told us that there is no empathy. People have no empathy. That's a typical bourgeois type, where everybody's an atom, and they all separate from each other, and nobody can empathize what is going on in the other person. But we can know when somebody dies and when somebody suffers, and that is one of our good abilities. So just that we know the focus point. Very often secular people charge religious people for not loving the transitory individuals enough. And they complain about this, about religion, but also about metaphysics. Metaphysicians are people who want to rescue religion by reconstructing it on the level of thought. And so both of them are charged with a lack of love for this physical living, for these material sufferings. Many people cannot even afford the luxury of having psychological sufferings. They have to go to their assembly line if they feel neurotic or not, and the state will not give them a pension because they are neurotic or whatever. So maybe it's the physical suffering which we are concerned with, this material suffering, and not only the suffering of the soul, which is for the majority of the people living in this world a tremendous luxury. They simply don't have the time and the energy to think about what goes on in their emotions or whatever, because they are hungry. So hunger as the symbol of real physical suffering. And there is hunger going on. There are people running already for care packages in some cities, and soon there will be soup kitchens like we had them all over 1929. And if these measures which the Roosevelt liberals now do, and very good measures, if they don't work, and there is no guarantee that they will work. Okay, so that is our specific point. What if, in addition to what secular people, namely these Roosevelt liberals, are taking measures, the measures they are taking now, if beyond that faith, and I mean now particularly the faith of the Abrahamic faith community, that means our Islamic brothers, our Jewish brothers, and all our Christian brothers, if this faith can make a contribution, and honestly, and if it is really sufficient, if we just say prayers and just say charity, and we will give you a little bit something or so, probably faith, in order to remain relevant, has to offer more than just prayer. They should not stop praying and they should not stop charity, but in the face of the catastrophe, more may be demanded from faith people. So then we said that we wanted to start always with some contemporary issues, which may have a relationship to what we want to do. I think the last time we talked about the excommunication thing, and the catastrophe goes further. So it's quite a question, if the trouble the Pope is in now measures really up to the economic tsunami from which millions and millions of people suffer. So it may be a small issue, and maybe it is not even, in the face of the catastrophe, it's not even worthwhile to look at it. But for the papacy and for the Roman Catholic Church, it is a little tsunami, or for them it's a big tsunami, while for the rest of the world it is a tiny one. So, but just very short, I want to remind you of it, because the present Pope still belongs to the tradition of an authoritarian type of a church, and we must be honest about this too. So the Orthodox brothers in Kiev, where we were, in Yalta and so on, they emphasize tradition, and our Protestant brothers, they emphasize the Gospels. And Roman Catholicism, its strength and its weakness is this authoritarianism. That means a very powerful hierarchy which is constructed from the papacy, through the bishops, to the priests, and to the deacons, and to the lay people. And there is a strong distinction that lay people, the word says it even, are those who are the object of the administration of sacraments and the administration of the word to them, and there is no real public opinion. They are receiving, and it should be done without criticism. Criticism is a bad word. There could be some positive critique, or that critique could be positive. Is not a real Catholic affair. One does not, father says and sister says, and if the little guy says at the table, well, then the father says, this is what father said, this is what sister said. And this is internalized then, and of course the father in the family then replaced, or represented the priest in the family, and so you have an authoritarian family, and you have an authoritarian church, and if you have a right-wing government and an authoritarian country, then the Catholics will be the best material for the FBI, or for the Gestapo, or for the whatever secret service, and for the officer corps, because this authoritarian personality fits into many organizations very well. So nevertheless, we don't say at the moment if it is good or bad. We just said that there is an alternative to this, namely a humanistic type of a way. So nevertheless, what has happened very shortly, and where we see this authoritarianism, and where we see that the spirit of Thomas More and of Erasmus and of the humanists at Küng and Metz today and so on, that this is not dominant in the church. That is what the event shows, unfortunately. Some people say that Joseph Ratzinger was originally a humanistic person, an Erasmian person, like Küng, like Metz, and so on. But that is unfortunately a rumor and a myth. From the very beginning, when he was consultant for Vatican II, he opposed every progressive proposal which any bishop brought in. There was only one exception, and these were the liturgical reforms. He was open for these liturgical reforms. And that is very important for the present scandal now. So when he then, when the Pope John the 23rd, John Paul II were taken in, the hierarchy wanted, people had nothing to do with it, the hierarchy wanted to have a Pope from Eastern Europe, and they made a deal that they would put behind his throne a great inquisitor, which is called now the prefect of the Congregation of Faith, so that he would watch, because the Pope John Paul II was a very pastoral man, very much concerned with people and with also with acting. He was very good in terms of addressing masses of people in a very simple way, and people loved him. So, but there had to be some cognitive factor there, somebody who would watch the dogmas and the orientation of action, the moral norms, and so on. And that was Ratzinger. And the deal was made that after they didn't know that he would live so long, but that Ratzinger would then take over, who now, of course, does not have too much time, neither taking his age into consideration. So, and nevertheless, everybody knew that he had become, even if he had been more Erasmian, more humanistic before, that he was not that any longer. He showed that in his attack against the liberation theologians, against the Brothers Cardinal, against Romero, against the basic Christian communities. There was even cooperation with the CIA in Nicaragua, and the Cardinal there worked together with him, and Opus Dei at the same time, which are all right-wing right-wing formations. So, and there was nothing toward the left, nothing toward Hans Küng to lift the ban on his teaching Catholicism, and nothing toward Boff, for instance, the liberation theologian, which left the priesthood and maybe even left the church, and others in Latin America. So it was right-wing in a certain sense from the very start. And so what had happened happens when any religious group, when they open up toward the world, then something happens inside of them. You could almost say that this is a sociological law. So the Roman Catholic Church opened up in the Second Vatican Council, and we don't have to see why that all happened, opened up toward the world, and then the splits occurred inside of it. And a group split off, namely the so-called Pious Brotherhood. The Pious Brotherhood under Lefebvre in Switzerland denied or resisted all the decisions which the Council had made, and wanted to stay with Vatican I, or wanted to stay with the Council of Trent against Luther and the Calvinists and so on, when they were all had been excommunicated. And of course, during the Council of Trent, there were also Erasmian forces. One was Bishop Helding. I wrote my dissertation about him. And but they were very uncomfortable in Trent. They left right away again. They did not trust the Pope, and the measures which they had taken to lift the celibacy for 3 years and the chalice was cancelled again by the Jesuits and by the Council. So. And all their attempts to make peace between the protesting Christians and the others failed. During the 1530s, 10 years, they tried their best and they didn't come through. And then the council came and somehow fixed the split. It was not intended. Luther did not want to split the church. Luther wanted to reform the church. That the church was split had something to do with the policies in Rome and in Trent. And so these people then, Tridentine Catholics, were excommunicated. that means the Pope and the Great Inquisitor said you cannot follow, you don't want to obey the canons of the Council, and therefore you are not members of the Roman Catholic Church anymore. Or you are dead members of the Roman Catholic Church, because when you're excommunicated, like Luther and Zwingli and so on, you do really remain a member of the Mysticum, but you are a dead one. And so, as good as none. So, and they left. Then, from the very beginning, the Church tried to set up a cardinal from Colombia, and he did the negotiation. And the negotiation lasted for 40 years. And after 40 years now, this Colombian was supposed to retire. Before his retirement, he wanted to bring those Lefebvre people, which were now 4 bishops, back into the church. And doing so, they were so eager to get these right-wing people back that they must not have looked precisely if they really accepted all the canons of the council, and they had not. They had somehow the intention that if they would go back, they would change the church, and the whole church would become little Talibans, because that's what they are. They are the Talibans of Christianity. So, and so that this was overlooked. This is not understood by anybody, not by the press in Europe. And there is a horrible, I think I showed you, some of you already, I have this whole thing here, and you can look into it, that these are the newspaper articles from one day in Europe. David, you can take it. And so, so there is an unbelievable excitement in the secular press, but also in the religious press. Some bishops have risen against the Pope. Some people talk about a schism, and that's all what we need. We have already 1,200 Christian groups here. Another schism, then the Fifth Reformed Catholic Church, or whatever. This would be not a good development. So, but so serious things have become in the meantime. So, particularly what they did not accept was the change of the liturgy on Saturday before Easter, namely about the abominable Jews who had killed Jesus and were responsible for his death. And so therefore Bishop Williams from England then in the airport and on television expressed this, that they have to hold on to it, that they will not give in, and even if it means martyrdom. And then somehow the thing shifted, that only 300,000 Jews had been killed, and that nobody had really been gassed, nobody was killed, but they died from hunger and overwork and so on. And so that is the Holocaust denial. And so he had to leave the airport in Germany very fast, otherwise the police would have come and caught him, because in Germany it's a crime. So this is the scandal which we have now, and what it shows us is exactly that what we discussed here. If there had been an Erasmian Pope, or a Pope who would have followed Thomas More, or would have followed Küng and so on, then the whole thing would have been different. But Catholics are stuck with this now for the next years or so, and this is very unfortunate. It is a crisis moment. It is a constitutional crisis, a question, how much the Pope knows. It has nothing to do with infallibility, because the Pope can always err in matter of policies and in matter of history and politics and so on. So some people in Germany said, he is infallible, and he didn't even know what they were signing and so on. So the infallibility dogma of 1870 is not connected with this type of knowledge. The Pope can err about the weather and geography and history and whatsoever. Parallel to when the Protestants talk about the inerrability of the New Testament, that means that error is excluded only in terms of matters of salvation. The other issues, the geographical issues, the time of the birth of Jesus or whatever, that can all be in error. Of course, there are errors in the New Testament, and there are errors, obviously, in the papacy, and these errors here now, they are bombastic, and so they don't know exactly how to handle it, and so they have crisis control, and in the Vatican they make this Colombian bishop, who has now retired, make him responsible for the whole thing now, and so push it off on him. So That happens very often in authoritarian systems. You know, the leader is good. Hitler knew nothing of the concentration camps. His underlings did it all, and so on. So you keep the top guy good, and then somebody had in Abu Ghraib there some GI has to take the responsibility, and so on. So and that's where we stand now. So we don't have to go, you know, because I discussed it with some of you, and I don't want to repeat. We can, if you have some questions, we can do this, answer them. But there is, are there some questions about this still? So then we can do it right away. Any issue, particularly how that is connected with us and what we ended up the last time, namely an authoritarian church, and on the other hand, an Erasmian humanistic type of a trend, a non-authoritarian, non-dogmatic type of a undercurrent, which was always there, but which has been weak. It broke through under John the 23rd for a short time, and in the council they did come through to some extent, and then after the council it was repressed again, and the result of this repression we have now in these scandals, in this scandal. Okay, is there any question about this contemporary issue which we want to be in contact with what is happening?
Dr. Siebert, would you guess that perhaps the American Catholic Church has been, perhaps since Vatican II, still more authoritarian?
Well, the American Catholic Church is always under a cloud, because there was around 1900, there was a thing which was called Americanism. And this Americanism was a particular version of what was called modernism. And modernism had been sentenced by the pious popes. That's why they call themselves Pious Brotherhood. The pious popes were very anti-modern people, and they had established a syllabus of sins of modernity. They had condemned everything modern, from the railroad to the to democracy, to liberalism, to socialism, to communism. Everything modern was condemned. And so then the version of this modernity was Americanism. And Americanism meant that some American bishops in Baltimore and in Washington, D.C. and so on wanted to take a more positive attitude toward the American Constitution. Two Jesuits, one was Father Weigel, called me here to the States. That's why I came to the States in 1965, because I always had been in ecumenical things with the Lutherans, and they wanted to get together with the Anglicans in Baltimore, and I was supposed to help. So, but these, Father Murray and Father Weigel, had written books how American Catholicism can be brought together with the American Enlightenment and the American Constitution. Not like Sirico to bring Catholicism and capitalism together, but rather to bring Catholicism and the American Constitution together, in terms of that Catholics could have a constitutional patriotism. They could be constitutionally patriotic, and they could be at the same time good Catholics. So, at that time, much suffering went on. Rome was very repressive toward American bishops, and from that time, American bishops have a particular fear of anything what may look like schism. That means breaking loose from Rome. And so there were, issue now with this child abuse. Of course, the Pope interfered with them. One archbishop, one cardinal in Boston had to leave his office and was called to Rome, and is still in Rome, and so on. So the Romans took care of this. But there are questions in terms of divorce and negative birth control and so on, where the bishops here are under tremendous pressure by their communities. The communities demand one thing and Rome demands another thing, and very often the bishops are, and I know personally at least 2 or 3 who have been just torn to pieces over this, their obedience to Rome, and then the contact with their real people in their diocese and so on. So, and therefore they are always a little bit more quiet than bishops would be in Europe. But also in Germany, of course, there was a so-called Episcopalian movement where the bishops, after the Vatican Council I, did not were not happy about the infallibility dogma which they had established in 1870, and so there was a danger that a few bishops would go on their own. So Germany has this issue too, that fear that there may be schismatic developments, and so one is more careful than the French or so, who don't have this type of a background. So therefore, at the moment, the bishops, one doesn't even hear much of this. You know, the German bishops are upset, but nothing has been heard of the American bishops, any protest or whatever, as if that was not of their concern or so. And it is particularly sharp in Germany because that is where the Jewish catastrophe happened, in Auschwitz and in hundreds of camps in Eastern Europe. So therefore it has an actuality for them which it does not have immediately for us here. Okay, anything else? The humanism has not come over here. Somehow it got drowned in the Atlantic or whatever. So that our Protestant brothers very often have a hostile feeling toward humanism. For them, only secular humanism exists. And that usually means Marxism or Skinnerianism or something like that. Now that is not adequate because Luther had strong humanistic elements besides authoritarian ones. And so Zwingli certainly, and the Protestant left, you know, the Anabaptists and the Baptists and the Mennonites and the Amish, we have them down in Indiana, in Goshen and so on. They have a strong humanistic and peaceful and democratic and so on tendencies. So therefore we do not have a real Erasmian movement in this country among the clergy or whatever. I don't think they understood Karl Rahner. I mean, I listened to Karl Rahner down, we went to Notre Dame, and then I went to the toilet, and the priest in the toilet said, "Oh, what is he talking about? What is he talking about?" They had no idea what he was talking about. And Küng came here and in the 60s, and he was very popular, you know, and people liked him, but I don't know if they really understood him. And then I had Küng here in the middle auditorium, and then I asked afterwards, he talked about a very simple thing, really, the religious and the secular dichotomy and how to settle it, and but I don't think that too many people understood him, and the bishop wrote that the clergy was not allowed to go to him even. So therefore, it's a little bit different here with the Erasmian or the humanistic tradition. If we had Thomas Aquinas still, forgot him with the council, there were humanistic elements as well. So, but, you know, as the Protestant brothers think about humanism, so I think many Catholics think the same way, that humanism is something secular and something profane. And there was in Erfurt already in East Germany, there was from the very beginning, at the time of Erasmus, there were atheistic humanists. So I don't deny this, but there were also, and the majority were Christian humanists like Erasmus. So so one doesn't have to pick, you know, the worst things of something. Okay, anything else about this? Yes.
On an entirely different subject.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
2 weeks ago, a whole gang of Amish people showed up at the mass I went to.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a chance to talk to them, but when it was over, they all got back into a van and left.
Mm.
But they were wearing, you know, the Amish hats and the black dresses they wear.
Yeah.
And some of them were children and some of them were
Yeah.
adults.
Where was that? Here? You mean?
Here, yes, in the mass, in
Thomas
the
More.
9 o'clock mass,
Oh.
9:30 mass.
We
rather,
must
9:30
have an
mass.
Erasmian. Father Ken must be an Erasmian.
I didn't get a chance to talk to them, and they were just here, and I was astounded.
Did they go to communion?
I think some of them did, which also surprised me because I was sure that they probably were not really Catholics
No.
because they were wearing
Right.
these Amish outfits. Did anyone see them or talk to them?
I did, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, this was, I think 2 weeks ago, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's wonderful. The Amish, that's the Protestant left, you know. And but there is, unfortunately, you know, one thing with this authoritarian thing is that there is no intercommunion. And so Catholics and Protestants of all shapes cannot go
Right,
to
yeah.
the same,
Well, that's why I was
to
so
the
surprised.
Eucharist or to the Last Supper. And this is such a sad thing, because that is the love center of Christianity, and exactly there they are split. And from the very beginning, Luther and Calvin met in Marburg, and Luther said, you don't have the right spirit, and because for Luther, the body in Christ was still real present, and for Calvin it wasn't. It was just symbolical. And so inside of the Protestant thing there was the split, and then between the Catholics and Luther there was the split of transubstantialization and consubstantialization and the symbolical thing. So they fell apart from the very start of the Reformation, and this has not been healed up to today. So I mean that Amish brothers come here and they cannot go to communion, are not allowed to, that is a very, very sad comment on the state of Christianity at the moment.
What's the connection with the Amish with Thomas Müntzer?
Well, they are one of those branches. It was a very, on the left, on the Protestant left, it was a very chaotic type situation. Thomas Müntzer, made himself available for these revolutionary farmers. He became something like their army chaplain or something like that. And he was the charismatic leader of them. So in Münster, there were the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists belonged to that group too, but who was what at what time is very hard to say. So they took over the city of Münster for 1 year and had a community of property and of women at the same time. And then the Bishop of Münster came back with an army and broke into the city and put them into a cage. And there is, when you go there today, I studied there in Münster and I saw that every morning. In the tower of the church they hang 3 cages, even today. In these cages they took these leaders, the 3 leaders of the Anabaptists, took them, and I hope they were dead when they put them into the cage, but they may have been alive, and they were just hanging them up there into the church for everybody to see.
Is
So
this who they call the Zweiku zealots, or Zweiku?
is that the German
I
word?
think something like that.
Oh. Well, what I know at the moment is, that this was one of these splinter groups. In Switzerland there was another group. The Anabaptists were simply people who didn't recognize the children's baptism, and they asked everybody to be baptized once more. It was a layman in Switzerland to introduce that, and suddenly became a movement. But it is not easy to categorize people who belong to the Protestant left. The Amish belong to it, the Mennonites belong to the Anabaptists belong to them. Who was fighting under Thomas Müntzer in 1525 in Mühlhausen is not entirely clear. They may have belonged to all of these groups. And during that one summer, 100,000 farmers were killed by the thought. I mean, they had to do it all by hand. And these were all kinds of so-called heretics who were killed in this stuff. And sometimes, the Amish or the Mennonites may have been put into prison by the Catholics, and the Catholics were very lax. They left the doors open very often. Then they run out, and then the Calvinists would catch them and would put them on the stake, and so on. So there was a mutual butchering going on, which then, small war then that century, and then of course the 1618 to 1638, the 30-year War, in which also all these groups were again involved. And since they were proletarian movements, people could not write, and it was not really registered. Very often you know about them only because Luther or the Catholics or Calvin would describe them, in court procedures or whatever, because they themselves couldn't write and could not formulate in written language who they were. Overall in history, it's always written. History is always written by the winners. And so there we have to be careful, even in the dogmatic struggle, Those who win, for instance, have the Tridentine confession, which we pray every Sunday, but all the opponents of it in Alexandria and in Caesarea and so on, they annihilated their writings, and very often the only way how you know something about them is because they have been sentenced. But what they really said, nobody knows. The same thing is with the Gnostics. Now the Gnostics were educated people, but they were also, you know, very often about them only because a council condemned them, or a bishop condemned them, or whatever. So history is written, as Benjamin says, you know, by the winners, and therefore these people were the losers, you know. They were lost twice in terms of the Catholics opposed them, and then the Lutherans opposed them, and the Calvinists opposed them. So Thomas Müntzer, for 300 years, nobody talked about him. And then Engels wrote the book about the Farmer War. That's when, the first time in the middle of the 19th century, somebody talked about Müntzer. And then Bloch in the 20th century. But the repression which goes on, you know, in history writing is enormous. So, you know, he was not only a heretic in terms of religious dogma, but he was also revolutionary. And he was not a revolutionary in the bourgeois sense. He was already a revolutionary in the proletarian sense. The Marxists, you know, sometimes put Thomas Müntzer into the camp of the bourgeois revolution, but the bourgeoisie did not follow him. The bourgeoisie went along with the nobility, and so he had no bourgeois people, he had only farmers. So really Thomas Müntzer anticipated a revolution after the revolution. That means the revolution against the bourgeoisie, not the bourgeois revolution, not the revolution of 1789 or whatever, but the revolution of 1917 he anticipated. So, okay, but we could make the connection there, you know, to what extent Thomas Müntzer, of course, was influenced. He was in Wittenberg too, like Luther, and they were brothers, you know, really, until Luther even fought for him and said he has a right to speak for his opinion and so on. And then Luther heard terrible terror stories of what the farmers had done to noblemen and so on. And then Luther changed his mind and turned against the farmers. And as he turned the farmers, he lost all his popularity in Germany. That was the end, really, of his popular time. You know, he was a charismatic person, and like Obama, you know, and everybody was for him. And then as soon as he wrote that thing, you know, butcher those damned farmers and so on, his popularity was gone among the common men, common people. Okay, so anybody else? Any other question? Now let's take it. Yes,
This isn't
okay.
a question, but this is just an observation. I originally lived in Pittsburgh, and various churches were vast distances from each other. And I had grown up Catholic, so I always went to a Catholic church. I didn't pay much attention. But since I have lived here, when I go downtown and see those 6 churches that are absolutely, their borders or their boundaries are sitting next to each other, and there's one across the street that's even bigger than some of the others, and there's another one just down the block that is, I just think, wow, you know, this suggests that there are various communities of faith that I know nothing about.
Yeah.
And it just surprises me. But I suspect that God...
You didn't have that in Pittsburgh?
We had other churches in Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
but since I went to my church and, you know,
Yeah, you didn't see it, so,
when
yeah.
I drove there, I just didn't see,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes I went past one, but they weren't sort of like they are here,
Yeah,
just
right.
all on top of each other.
Yeah.
I trust and hope that God will accept us all in
Yeah.
whatever faith community we come
Well,
through.
since-
I,
yeah.
of course, since I've always been Catholic,
Right.
believe that our church is the best, the one
Yeah.
that should be, but it's, when I go down there and see all these different ones sitting right next to each other, I think, what is
Well,
going on?
If you are a real Erasmian and a real Thomas More person, then you will say that, of course, Catholicism is the best, but you will be open at the same time, you know, to discourse with the
Oh,
others.
yes, of
And we do
course.
have that in Kalamazoo, you know, for years and years. All these denominations are meeting for,
Oh, really?
for lunch. Yeah, there's a Grace luncheon that was called.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I went there sometimes. Yeah.
That is
So I don't know if it's going on, but it was going on for, they do talk with each other, and I think the relationship is rather friendly.
Well, and I also want to believe that anyone of faith is ultimately going to be saved by God, even
Yeah.
though it may not be the right church, which of course is our church, but...
Also, that is a Catholic, the Catholic position, you know, that if, of course, you know, Catholicism is the way to salvation, but if other people, you know, cannot see that out of some reason, psychological or sociological, then they must be saved by their own faith. That is the Catholic position. So if you have McCain bombing Hanoi to pieces and then comes down, shut down with a cross around his neck, how should they know what Christianity is when he has just killed all these women and children there? It's impossible. It's psychologically and sociologically impossible. So then they have to be saved by, if God is all saving, then it must be saved by Marxism or saved by Buddhism or whatever they are, right? And there was even a Jesuit who denied this, and he has been excommunicated. He was in Boston. He thought only Catholic can be saved, but the Catholic Church itself sentenced him. So yeah, there you can be sure of it. So that's very good.
Was that the position of the church during the time of Thomas More and Henry VIII?
Well, I have to correct myself in terms of Thomas More, because Thomas More unfortunately did sentence heretics to death by burning. So therefore he was not really in an ecumenical mood in that sense. So we have to now, even with a saintly person, saints are not people who have not done terrible things. Paul, Paul was a mass murderer. He went up to Damascus, he killed Stephanus, and so on and so on. So then he converted, and so Thomas More has also this dark side, that there were the Wycliffe people who 100 years before Luther, they had already Lutheran ideas, and so under Charles V, VIII, Henry VIII, they were persecuted, and he was Thomas More was the Lord Chancellor, and he executed this. He sentenced them to burn alive, and so on. So there was not real talk about this. And then also his attitude in terms of Rome, and the primacy of Rome, and Rome alone is a rather rigid position, which he took and for which he died. Therefore, it is amazing that it took him 400 years in Rome to canonize him. But we said already why that happened. It happened because he married 3 months after the death of his wife, and that was not a virtuous behavior according to the Church. And amazingly, they did not hesitate to canonize him because of the heretics he killed. That was probably a good thing to do. The other thing was a bad thing. So, okay. Do we have any other question about this incident now, which is continuing and is a real very serious crisis? The Pope has one crisis after the other. A year before that, he was thrown out of the University of Rome because he had said that the Inquisition toward Galileo was right after all, and so. Then in Regensburg he got in trouble with the Muslim brothers because he quoted a story and said that since Muhammad everything went wrong in the world. And he's not a specialist for Islamic affairs, but he depended on a scholar in Münster who fished out that story, and I don't even know why he told it. The tendency of the story, of his speech, was a completely different one, an opposite one, so that went wrong too. So now he will go to Jerusalem soon, and so he has to get his act together before he goes there. He himself made an unfortunate remark, because he said recently that one should have a prayer for the conversion of the Jews. You see, the closeness and the distance between him and the 4 heretical bishops, they want to keep that the sentence of the abominable Jews who killed Jesus. And Ratzinger wants the Jews to be converted. Now, why do they have to be converted when they are the older brothers, or the rabbis say the younger brothers? They belong to the same family, so there has not to be real conversion or whatever. So the Jews were very upset about that. So they are upset about the 4 heretics, but they are upset about the Pope too, about praying for their conversion, because they think there is no need for them to be converted. Because their covenants are valid for the Christians. And so, but of course for the Jews, the Jesus covenant is not valid. So there we have a problem. So nevertheless, for us it's important, that an authoritarian type of a church will have a different attitude to all of that than when you have an Erasmian or a Thomas More attitude or a Küng attitude or a Metz attitude. And how great the tension is here, you can see that the bishop wrote a letter that Küng was not to be received, and that people were